Okay, so for centuries, we've had this one core belief about ourselves, right? That this 3 pound universe inside our skull, our brain, it creates everything we call consciousness. Our thoughts, our feelings, our entire sense of me. It's all supposedly cooked up right in there. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's not even close?
Yeah, what if the brain isn't the generator, but it's more like a super sophisticated antenna? A biological receiver that's just tuning into a signal that's, well, already out there. Okay, we've got to dive into this because this one single idea, man, it could flip everything we think we know about the mind right on its head.
So, to really wrap our heads around this receiver model, we first need to look at the puzzles, the weird bits, that the standard model of consciousness just can't quite solve. Those little spots where the data just refuses to fit in the box. All right, so the standard view, it's pretty straightforward actually. Just think of your brain like a factory. The more neurons you have firing, the more complex the machinery gets, and the more consciousness it cranks out. It's what they call a generative model, meaning consciousness is just a product being manufactured by all that neural activity. Simple enough, right? But here's the thing. Science absolutely thrives on the weird stuff, the anomalies, those glitches in the matrix, where the evidence just doesn't line up with the theory. And let me tell you, when it comes to consciousness, there are some, whoa, really profound ones.
Okay, let's start with a really big one. Near-death experiences. I mean, we've all heard the stories, right? People report these incredibly vivid, structured, and often life-changing experiences, all while they're in cardiac arrest. They're talking about seeing things unfold around them, watching their life flash before their eyes, having these really complex thoughts and deep emotions.
And here is where the problem gets really, really clear. During these incredible experiences, the brain's electrical activity, what you'd measure with an EEG, can be less than 5 microvolts. I mean, that is, for all intents and purposes, a flat line. The factory is closed, the lights are off, the machines are cold, and yet somehow this incredibly rich experience is still happening. So the billion-dollar question is, where is it coming from?
And look, it's not just this one puzzle. Researchers are pointing to at least three major discrepancies. First, you've got these near-death experiences happening with almost zero brain activity. Then you have these documented cases, and this is wild, of people with totally preserved awareness even after losing over 90% of their cortex. And then there's this really fascinating preliminary data showing brainwaves syncing up between people who are completely isolated from each other. The old factory model, it just doesn't have a good answer for any of this.
So all these weird anomalies, they basically force us to start looking for a different way to think about it. And that brings us right to this alternative idea, the brain as a receiver. Right, so this is what's called the receiver brain hypothesis, or RBH for short. And the core idea is this. Consciousness isn't made by the brain. Instead, it's something fundamental, something that's already out there in the universe, and our brain just tunes into it. The hypothesis suggests that our brain acts like a decoder, taking this ever-present field of information and translating it into what you and I feel as our own personal subjective experience. So if you put these two ideas head to head, it's really clear. In the old factory model, it's simple. More complexity equals more consciousness. But in this new antenna model, it's more nuanced. It's not just about how complex the hardware is, it's about its decoding fidelity. In other words, how well can it actually tune in and process that signal? Okay, so if the brain really is an antenna, the next logical question is how? How does it actually work? How does it tune into this signal? Well, the RBH actually proposes a really specific nuts and bolts biophysical pathway. It's basically a 4-step process. So step 1, you've got the substrate, this fundamental field of information that's just everywhere. Step 2, the brain's own ultra-low frequency electromagnetic field links up with it. That's your antenna. Step 3, these tiny little protein structures inside our neurons, they're called microtubules. They do the heavy lifting, the actual decoding. And then step 4, all that decoded information, well, that becomes the rich, colorful, subjective experience that we call consciousness.
Now, I know you might be thinking, this all sounds a little philosophical, right? A bit sci-fi, maybe. But here's what I think is the most important part of this whole thing. This is not just a cool idea. The receiver brain hypothesis was built from the ground up to be a testable, falsifiable, honest-to-goodness scientific proposal. And really, that's the entire point. The whole idea is to shift the conversation away from this kind of vague concept of generation and toward the much more concrete, measurable process of decoding. It actually gives scientists a roadmap to design real-world experiments to figure this out. And this is where it gets really exciting, because we can make clear predictions where the two models just flat out contradict each other. For example, the RBH predicts that if you disrupt those little microtubule decoders, it should mess with the content of someone's experience, what they're seeing or thinking, not just whether they're awake or not. The standard model, it has no reason to predict that specific effect. See, these are things we can actually go into a lab and test. So, when you put it all together, you look at the weird evidence, the proposed mechanism, and the actual ways we can test it, you start to appreciate just how big this idea really is. And it leaves us staring at, well, the biggest question of all. Really, the main takeaway here is the potential for a complete paradigm shift in how we see ourselves. I mean, we'd be moving from seeing the brain as a creator of consciousness to seeing it as a decoder of a reality that's already here. Now, we have to be clear-eyed about this. Of course, the hypothesis has its limits right now. The nature of this information substrate, yeah, that's still a complete mystery. Some parts of the mechanism are for sure speculative. And, as with any consciousness research, trying to objectively measure what's going on in someone's head is always a huge, huge challenge. But even with all those caveats, the receiver brain hypothesis just cracks open the door to a completely new way of seeing, well, everything. And it leaves us with this one final, kind of mind-bending question to chew on. If our brain is just the receiver, then who or what is broadcasting the signal?